Before we begin, subscribe now, because some records were never meant to be found, and this is one of them. In the summer of 1849, deep in the lowlands of South Carolina, there stood a plantation known as Briarwood Estate. From a distance, it looked like every other plantation. White columns, long cotton fields, silent workers moving under the burning sun, and a large house watching over everything like a judge. But inside that house, hidden behind locked doors and forgotten shelves, there was something far more dangerous than any weapon. A ledger, a simple book, bound in cracked brown leather, its pages filled with names, dates, numbers, and near the end, 7 names, crossed out in blood. The book belonged to plantation owner Edward Harrow. He was not an old man, not yet, only 42, tall, thin, always dressed in black. He was known as a man of order, precision. He believed everything had its place. Every person had a purpose. Every action had a consequence. Nothing escaped his attention. Nothing escaped his record. He wrote everything down: births, deaths, purchases, punishments, even dreams. Workers said he never forgot anything, but they also said he was afraid of losing control, afraid of something he never named. Edward inherited Briarwood Estate after his father died suddenly in 1847. His father had ruled the plantation for nearly 30 years. But Edward was different. His father had been loud, violent, predictable. Edward was quiet, cold, watching. He spent more time in his study than in the fields, more time writing than speaking. The ledger became his obsession. Every night, candlelight burned in his study until morning, and every morning he looked more tired, more pale, more afraid. At first, no one noticed anything unusual. The plantation ran as it always had. Workers labored. Overseers shouted. Cotton was harvested, sold. Life continued. But then, the first name was crossed out. It happened in October. The name was Samuel. He was 26. Strong, healthy, reliable. He had worked at Briarwood for 6 years. And then one morning, he was gone. No warning, no explanation. His cabin was empty. His tools left behind, his shoes still by the door. He had not run away. Everyone knew that, because nothing was missing, and no one saw him leave. When Edward updated the ledger that night, he wrote Samuel's name. Then he stopped. He stared at it for a long time, his hand trembling. Then he dipped his pen into something darker than ink and drew a thick red line through Samuel's name. The next day, workers whispered. They said Samuel had angered the master. They said he had tried to escape. They said he had been punished. But none of it was true, because no one saw Samuel again. Not dead, not alive, just gone. Edward never spoke of him, but he locked the ledger away after that. He began carrying the key with him at all times. And something else changed. He started watching the workers more closely, especially at night. He walked the halls after midnight, listening, waiting, as if expecting something to return. Weeks passed. Then the second name was crossed out. Her name was Eliza. She worked inside the main house. Quiet, invisible, she had served Edward's family since childhood. She knew every room, every hallway, every secret. One night, Margaret, the cook, saw her walking toward the back staircase. She never came back down. By morning, she was gone. Edward locked himself in his study for hours. No one was allowed inside. When he finally emerged, his face was pale, his hands shaking. That night, he opened the ledger again and crossed out her name in blood. After that, fear spread across Briarwood Estate. Workers stopped speaking freely. They avoided the main house after dark. They slept lightly, listening for footsteps, because something was happening, and no one understood why. Even the overseer grew nervous. He asked Edward directly, "Sir, what's happening to them?" Edward stared at him coldly. "They are being accounted for." That was all he said. Being accounted for. Not missing. Not dead. Accounted for. As if they still existed somewhere. Somewhere only Edward knew. By winter, 5 names were crossed out. 5 people vanished without trace. No bodies. No evidence. Only the ledger and the blood. Edward stopped sleeping entirely. Servants heard him talking alone in his study, arguing, whispering, begging. They said he wasn't talking to himself. He was talking to something else. Something no one could see. One night, Margaret pressed her ear against the study door. She heard Edward say something she never forgot. "They were yours. I gave them to you. Leave the rest." Her blood ran cold. She ran back to her room. And never after Edward Harrow disappeared, Briarwood Estate fell into a silence no one could explain. Not the normal silence of fear. Not the silence of obedience. But something heavier. Something watching. His study door had to be forced open. The overseer, Thomas Greaves, was the one who broke it down himself. He expected to find a body, or signs of escape. But there was nothing. The room was exactly as Edward had left it. The chair slightly pushed back. The candle burned down, the cold wax, and the ledger sitting open on the desk. Waiting. Thomas stepped inside slowly. Every instinct told him to leave, but curiosity pulled him forward. He approached the desk, looked down, and froze. Edward's name was there, written clearly, at the bottom of the page, below the other 7. But unlike the others, it was not crossed out. Not yet. Thomas felt a strange pressure in his chest, like the room itself was breathing, watching him, waiting. He reached toward the book, then stopped, because something was wrong. The ink on Edward's name wasn't dry. It was fresh, still dark, still wet. Thomas pulled his hand back immediately. That was impossible. Edward had vanished 2 days ago. No one had entered this room since. And yet, someone had written his name after he disappeared. Thomas closed the ledger slowly. He didn't tell anyone what he saw. Not at first, because he didn't understand it, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. Edward had no wife, no children, no immediate heirs. That meant Thomas was now responsible for this estate, at least temporarily. But he didn't want it. Not really, because he could feel it. Something was wrong with this place. Something had been wrong long before Edward vanished. He began searching the study carefully, looking for answers, looking for anything Edward had left behind. Most of the room was ordinary. Books, letters, financial records. But one thing stood out, a small iron key, hidden inside Edward's desk drawer, separate from everything else. It was older than the other keys, rust creeping along its edges. Thomas turned it over in his hand. It didn't match any door in the main house, which meant it belonged somewhere else, somewhere hidden. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He stayed in Edward's room, listening, waiting, and sometime after midnight, he heard it, a sound, soft, distant, a slow dragging noise, like something moving across wood. He stood immediately, heart pounding, listening harder. The sound came again, below him, from beneath the floor. Thomas grabbed a lantern, walked into the hallway, and followed the sound. Step by step, it led him to the back of the house, to a door he had never noticed before. It was small, old, almost hidden behind a storage cabinet. Thomas had lived at Briarwood for years, but he had never seen that door open. He approached carefully. The dragging sound stopped. Silence returned, but he could still feel it, something waiting on the other side. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle. Locked. He looked at the iron key in his hand. It fit perfectly. He hesitated. Every instinct told him not to open it, but Edward was gone. 7 others were gone, and this was the only lead he had. He turned the key. The lock clicked, louder than it should have. Thomas pushed the door open slowly. Darkness waited inside. Thick, heavy, unnatural. The lantern light barely touched it. A staircase led downward, into the earth beneath the house. Thomas stepped inside. The air was cold, damp, wrong. Each step creaked beneath his weight. He descended slowly, carefully, the lantern flickering. The walls were dirt, old, unfinished. This place had been hidden for a long time. At the bottom, the staircase opened into a narrow underground room. Small, empty, almost, except for one thing. A chair, bolted to the floor, facing the wall, and beside it, dark stains. Old, brown, layered. Thomas stepped closer, his breath shallow. The stains weren't random. They were deliberate, controlled. He turned the lantern toward the wall and saw something carved into the wood. 7 marks, 7 deep lines, cut into the surface. 1 for each name, 1 for each person who disappeared. Thomas's stomach tightened. Edward hadn't just recorded their disappearances. He had brought them here. Something terrible had happened in this room. Something planned. Something repeated. Then Thomas saw something else. At the base of the chair. A fresh stain. Not brown. Red. New. Edward had been here too. Recently. Very recently. Thomas backed away slowly, his heart racing, because now he understood something far worse. Edward hadn't been taken. Edward had come here willingly. But why? And for what? Thomas turned to leave, but before he reached the stairs, he heard it. A whisper. Soft. Close. Right behind him. Not words. Just breath. Thomas spun around. The room was empty, but the lantern flickered violently, the flame shrinking, struggling, as if something unseen was draining the air. Thomas ran up the stairs, slamming the door behind. Thomas Greaves did not open the hidden door again. Not the next day. Not the next week. Not even when the whispers returned. Because they did return. Every night. Soft sounds beneath the floor. Dragging. Scraping. Breathing. At first, he told himself it was a house settling. Old wood shifting. Nothing more. But deep inside, he knew that was a lie. The sounds were too deliberate. Too patient. Like something waiting. Waiting for its name. Thomas stopped sleeping in Edward's room. He moved into a smaller bedroom on the far side of the house, as far from the hidden door as possible. But distance didn't help, because whatever lived beneath Briarwood wasn't confined to one place. It moved, silently, watching. 3 nights after he found the underground room, Thomas had his first dream. He stood in Edward's study, alone, the ledger open before him, its pages turning by themselves, slowly, one by one, until they reached the final page. Edward's name stared back at him, and then a red line appeared, drawing itself across the name. Thomas tried to look away, but he couldn't move, his body frozen, his lungs refusing to breathe. And then he heard it, a voice, low, dry, ancient, not spoken aloud, but inside his head. Balance must be kept. Thomas woke screaming, his body soaked in sweat, his chest tight, his throat raw. The room was empty, but he knew the voice was real. It had been waiting. Edward hadn't chosen those 7 names randomly. He had been feeding something. Something that required balance. 7 taken, 7 given, and when he failed to give more, it took him instead. Thomas avoided the ledger after that. He locked it inside a cabinet, buried beneath other records. He told himself it didn't matter, that whatever Edward had done was over, finished, gone. But the plantation didn't feel finished. Workers began reporting strange things. Tools moved overnight, doors opening by themselves, footsteps in empty rooms. One worker, Daniel, claimed he saw someone standing outside his cabin, tall, thin, watching him. When Daniel called out, the figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, still, silent, waiting. Then it was gone. Daniel refused to work after that. He refused to stay. He packed his few belongings and left Briarwood before sunrise. No one stopped him. No one blamed him, because others had seen things too. Shadows where no one stood. Movement in the corners of their vision. The feeling of being watched. Constantly, Thomas tried to maintain order, tried to act as Edward had. Cold, controlled, unafraid, but inside he was breaking, because every night the whispers grew louder, closer, more demanding, and then the ledger moved. Thomas found it on his desk one morning, open. He was certain he had locked it away, certain no one else had access, but there it was, waiting. He approached it slowly, carefully, afraid of what he would see. When he reached the final page, his blood ran cold. Edward's name was crossed out, a thick red line drawn through it. Fresh, wet, new. Thomas staggered backward, his hands trembling. That meant only one thing. Edward was gone, truly gone. Whatever had taken him had finished its claim. The balance had been restored. Or so Thomas thought, because beneath Edward's name, there was another, his own, Thomas Greaves, written in the same careful handwriting, the same ink, the same certainty. Thomas hadn't written it. No one had seen him write it, but it was there, waiting. He slammed the ledger shut, locked it away again, his breathing shallow, his mind racing. He understood now. The ledger wasn't just a record. It was a contract, a list, and once your name appeared, it never left. Not until the balance was complete. Thomas tried to leave Briarwood that very day. He packed his belongings, prepared his horse, ready to ride away and never return. But when he reached the edge of the plantation, the horse refused to move. It panicked, reared, threw him to the ground. Thomas tried again, and again, but each time the same thing happened. The horse would not cross the boundary. It was as if something held them there. Something invisible, something absolute. Thomas realized then he wasn't free to leave. None of them were, because the plantation itself was part of it. The house, the land, the ledger, all connected, all bound together, waiting for the next name to be fulfilled. That night, Thomas sat alone in his room, listening to the whispers. They were clearer now, closer, not random, not meaningless. They were calling him, inviting him, promising release, promising peace. If he only came downstairs, if he only opened the door again. Thomas covered his ears, closed his eyes, refused to listen. But deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time, because Edward had tried to stop too, and Edward had failed. Thomas Greaves lasted 11 days after seeing his name in a ledger. 11 days of fear, 11 days of denial, 11 days of pretending he still had control. But Briarwood Plantation had already made its decision, and it never changed its mind. On the 12th night, the whispers stopped being whispers. They became instructions, clear, precise, unavoidable. Thomas sat in his room, staring at the locked cabinet where the ledger rested. He hadn't opened it again. He didn't need to. He already knew what it would say. His name was there, waiting, calling him. Outside, the wind had died completely. No insects, no animals, no sound. The plantation felt frozen in time, as if the entire world were holding its breath. Then came the knock, soft, slow, from beneath the floor. Thomas froze. The knock came again, 3 times. He stood without realizing he decided to move. His body felt heavy, not controlled by force, but by inevitability. He walked into the hallway. The house was darker than usual. The lanterns had gone out, though he was certain he had lit them before sunset. Only the study door remained visible, slightly open, waiting. Thomas stopped in front of it. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might kill him before anything else could. But the whispers had returned, not frightening anymore. Calm, patient, welcoming. He pushed the door open. Edward's study looked exactly as it had the day he died. The desk, the chair, the cabinet, the hidden door beneath the rug. Thomas stared at the rug. He knew what waited below. He knew what it wanted. And still, he moved it, slowly, revealing the wooden hatch beneath. It was already open. He didn't remember opening it, but it didn't matter. The darkness below seemed deeper than before, endless, hungry. Thomas stood at the edge for a long time, waiting for courage or mercy. He received neither, only certainty. He stepped down. The wooden ladder creaked beneath his weight, each step colder than the last. The air grew heavier, harder to breathe. The whispers grew louder, clearer, until they were no longer whispers. They were voices, many voices, layered, speaking at once, yet somehow understandable. You were written. You were chosen. The balance must remain. Thomas reached the bottom. The underground room had changed. The walls were no longer bare. Names covered them. Dozens, hundreds, written over decades. Some faded, some fresh, all permanent. The table still stood in the center, but now the ledger rested on it, open, waiting. Thomas approached it slowly, his hands shaking, his mind screaming at him to stop, but his body didn't listen. He stood before the book, looked down. His name stared back at him. Thomas Greaves. The ink looked wet, as if it had just been written seconds ago. A pen lay beside the ledger, its tip stained red. Thomas understood what he was meant to do, not write his name, but complete it. The balance required more than ink. It required acknowledgement, acceptance. The voices grew louder. The air grew colder. Thomas reached for the pen. The moment his fingers touched it, the whispers stopped. Silence filled the room. Complete. Absolute. Thomas lifted the pen, held it above his name, and waited for pain, for resistance, for something to stop him. Nothing did. He drew the line, straight across his own name. The moment he finished, the lantern behind him lit by itself. A sudden violent flame. Thomas turned and saw them, shapes in the darkness. Tall, thin, watching. Not human, not anymore. Their faces blurred, their bodies incomplete, but their presence undeniable. They were the others. The names crossed out before him. They stood silently, not threatening, not welcoming, simply present. The balance had been restored. Thomas felt something leave him, not his body, but something deeper, something essential. His fear disappeared. His thoughts slowed. His breathing steadied. Peace replaced terror, because the waiting was over. Thomas Greaves turned away from the ledger, walked toward the darkness, toward the figures, toward whatever came next, and he was never seen again. 3 weeks later, a distant cousin arrived at Briarwood Plantation. Samuel Greaves. He had received the letter, the inheritance, the responsibility. He entered the empty house alone. Dust covered everything. Untouched, silent, he explored the room slowly, carefully, until he found the study, the desk, the cabinet, and inside, the ledger. Samuel opened it, curious, confused. He turned the pages, names, dates, records, until he reached the end. He saw Edward's name, crossed out. He saw Thomas's name, crossed out. Samuel frowned. He didn't understand. He turned the page and froze, because at the bottom, in fresh ink, was a new name, Samuel Greaves, waiting.